This is chapter 4 of your textbook, which is called Behavior and Attitudes. So let's first define attitude. We essentially know the definition of behavior, it's how we act, but attitude's a little bit more complicated. The definition I like best is attitude is the way in which a person views and evaluates something or someone. It's a predisposition or a tendency to respond either positively or negatively toward a certain idea, object, person, or situation. There are two types of attitudes discussed in your textbook. These are implicit versus explicit attitudes. An implicit attitude would be inner unconscious beliefs. We don't really have to think about these attitudes, they're just automatically there. An explicit or a conscious belief is a belief that we outwardly show, that we have to consciously come up with. For example, I think stereotypes are often implicit when we see a person who perhaps is dressed in a business suit, and we might have used this example before, who is dressed in a business suit and carrying a briefcase. We automatically, unconsciously think, oh, that must be a businessman. We don't have to consciously think about that. So that's an implicit attitude, which I said often I think is like a stereotype. So if implicit attitudes are unconscious, then how do psychologists measure them? If it's automatic and unconscious, how do you measure it? Mainly they measure it with the implicit association test, which is a series of stimuli, words and or images, is presented to each respondent, and they must sort them into two categories. The key assumption underlying any implicit association test is that the stronger the association a respondent makes between concepts, the faster they are to make these associations. So you can see from the example that people are given a picture of Coke. They immediately have to pick artificial or natural, and the assumption is, again, how quickly they make this association determines the implicit belief that they have. So if I more quickly make the assumption that Coke is artificial, the psychologist is going to assume that that was my implicit belief. That's unconscious, almost an unconscious belief, because I don't have time to think about it. So attitude, we know, predicts behavior. However, attitude isn't the only predictor of behavior. Behavior is also situational. In other words, we may act differently in different situations. For example, I probably act differently at church than I do when hanging out with my friends. So my behavior is totally dependent on the situation I'm in. The theory of planned behavior is a theory that links beliefs to behavior. So the theory maintains that three core components: your attitude, which we already know that attitude affects our behavior; subjective norms, which are just the norms of society. What are we expected to do in certain situations? And perceived behavioral control. How much control do we have over the situation? Those three things together shape an individual's behavioral intentions. Those three things shape how we behave in certain situations. So let's look at the opposite. We've looked at how attitude might affect our behavior. How does behavior affect our attitude? Role playing. Sometimes we behave a certain way in a situation because it's how we're expected to behave. For example, an introvert may be placed in a social situation in which they're expected to be talkative and outgoing. They may be able to fulfill this role, the role of an extrovert, but it's likely going to feel fake and forced. So sometimes we're just placed in situations where we know that the norm that we just discussed is that we're expected to act a certain way. And so we fulfill that even if it feels unnatural. Also, pleasing the listener. We often say things and behave in ways that will please others. It seems that if we say these things and behave this way long enough, not only will the other congratulate us and be pleased with us, but they may come to believe what we're saying and agree with us. Evil acts and moral acts. It seems that when we perform an evil act, we kind of get the attitude that we can perform even a more evil act, perform a worse act. And like I said in the PowerPoint, thank goodness it's also true that when we commit good acts, it seems to make our attitude that it's easier to commit good acts in the future. So, why does their behavior affect our attitude and vice versa? We've looked at how behavior affects attitude, how attitude affects behavior, but why do they affect each other? One reason is self presentation. We all care about what other people think of us. So, we want people to have good thoughts on our attitude and our behavior. Cognitive dissonance. We are motivated to maintain consistency among our thoughts. We don't like to have random thoughts that don't match each other. And if we do have random thoughts that don't match each other, it can create tension. For example, I know smoking is unhealthy, but I continue to do it anyway. If too much tension is created between those two things, then we're likely to change our behavior and stop smoking. Self perception. It's as if we're observing our own behavior. So, for example, I may kind of look at myself and think, man, I've smoked for 10 years, so I must like smoking. So, my behavior again is connected to my attitude. So, just a reminder, I think we've looked at this diagram before, but in looking at attitude and behavior, keep in mind that thoughts create feelings, feelings create behavior, and behavior reinforces thoughts. This is an endless cycle that, again, our thoughts, feelings, and behavior are all connected. Thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.